welcome to Redefining Airmanship. This is session 2 of the 6 sessions in the webinar series. Glad you could join us this morning. And just a quick review on operating the system. If you want to minimize your control panel, you just click on that little orange arrow and click on it again to maximize the panel. If you have a question or you want to make a comment, please raise your hand by clicking on the raise hand icon there, and I'll see it here on my control panel. Or you can type in a question or comment, and if you do that, make sure you hit the send button to send it to me. In this session, we're going to concentrate on the 5 pillars of knowledge in Kern's airmanship model. This is a Wings program seminar, so you do get 1 knowledge credit for attending, and I'll make sure that you get credit for that. Again, what we're really trying to answer here, the big question is, if I don't fly right, should I fly at all? The webinar series is based on Tony Kern's book, Redefining Airmanship. Let's take just a quick review of session 1 to make sure we're all on the same page. In session 1, we came up with a shared definition of airmanship that we agreed to. And that shared definition was: expert airmen possess discipline, skill, and proficiency. Expert airmen have a thorough understanding of themselves, their aircraft, their team, their environment, and the risks they face. And expert airmen consistently display exceptional situational awareness and use good judgment at all times. So would you please raise your hand if you agree with that definition of airmanship? Just click on the raise your hand icon on your control panel. I see some of you raising your hand. Jason, you want to raise your hand if you agree with that definition? Okay, thank you. So let's review Kern's airmanship model briefly. Remember, we have the 3 bedrock principles of discipline, skill, and proficiency, upon which rest the 5 pillars of knowledge: self, aircraft, team, environment, and risk. And upon those 5 pillars of knowledge rest the capstone outcomes of situational awareness and judgment. Let me say that a different way slightly. If we practice the bedrock principles of discipline, skill, and proficiency while always striving for perfect knowledge of self, aircraft, team, environment, and risk, we can expect ever-improving capstone outcomes of situational awareness and better judgment. Let's review discipline briefly. Flight discipline is defined as the ability and willpower to safely employ an aircraft within operational, regulatory, organizational, and common sense guidelines. Flight discipline must be the foundation of an aviator's airmanship package. If you don't have discipline, none of the rest of this model is going to help you to improve your airmanship. You must have discipline, and the more perfect the discipline, the better. In fact, I just had lunch with a friend of mine that I hadn't seen in, I don't know, about 20-some years. We started out at United about the same time. Back in the late 60s, we flew in the National Guard together. Carl Eberle's his name. He retired as a 747 captain for United. And for the last 5 years, he's been flying a Challenger and a charter and corporate operation. And I always admired Carl back in the days when we were young aviators for his discipline. He really had discipline in all aspects of his life. Now I see him at his mid-60s, and he's still extremely disciplined, and that's what's made him a really good airman all this time. All right, let's review skill. Remember, Yeager said, if you're going to fly, do it right. Skill building, Flying requires multiple skills that are developed in and out of formal training. So we have to think about when we're flying, not in a training situation, that we're really working on our skills. We're either improving them, or they're degrading, or we're at least maintaining them. So skill development takes place anytime we're flying. In addition to physical flying skills, excellent airmanship requires excellent communication skills, decision-making skills, team skills, and self-assessment skills. And those are the most important ones, the self-assessment skills. But the good news is they're skills. And you can learn how to self-assess. There are checklists, there are techniques, and we'll talk about those later on in the webinar series. And finally, to review proficiency from the last session. Experience builds airmanship skills. Recent experience accounts for proficiency. So you have your skills, but if you're not current, if you don't fly frequently, and haven't flown recently, your proficiency will suffer. We talked about this last time, again, but I want to emphasize it. Less than 500 hours in model, significantly greater risk for pilot error. So most of us in private flying don't have 500 hours in the model of airplane we're flying, so you have to keep that in mind. You already have an increased risk factor unless you have more than 500 hours in model. And less than 10 flight hours in 30 days, you're at far greater risk. And most of us in private flying don't fly that 10 hours at least a month. 30 hours in 30 days is the optimum point you want to shoot for. But again, cost, time, everything else, it's hard for us to fly 30 hours a month in private flying. So we have to just know and take that into our decision making, that we're at far greater risk because we aren't flying as much. That 10 to 30 hours is the sweet spot, with 30 hours being the optimum. The Air Force study upon which these statements are based found that actually over 30 hours a month, proficiency started falling off due to things like complacency and fatigue. And remember, just because it's legal doesn't mean that it's safe. Just because you've had your 3 takeoffs and landings in the last 90 days doesn't mean you can go out there and tackle 17-knot direct crosswind. It's legal, but it's not safe. Flight skill loss occurs rapidly, unfortunately, but it does occur rapidly. Pilots are not good at assessing their proficiency in specific flight tasks, and this has been established through research. So we're not good at identifying our weak spots when it comes to proficiency. Patterns of proficiency loss. The greatest skill loss occurs in the least desirable areas, wouldn't you know? Those are landings, traffic pattern operations, accelerated stalls, crosswind landings, crosswind takeoffs, minimum controlled airspeed, and steep turns. So we lose those skills very rapidly, and those are like basic skills for all of the other maneuvers we have to execute when we're flying. So that was session 1 review. We covered those bedrock principles. In this session, we're going to cover the 5 pillars of knowledge. And in session 3, we'll take a very detailed look at situational awareness and judgment. At this point, do you have any questions or comments? If you do, please raise your hand or type in a question. And I'll give you just a minute here to think about it. Okay, it looks like there are no questions or comments at this time, so let's move on into the new material. We're going to talk about the 5 pillars of knowledge. Those 5 pillars are self, aircraft, team, environment, and risk. And we'll start with knowledge of self. Socrates, the Greek philosopher, said, "Know thyself." And that still holds true today, especially when it comes to piloting. Kern, his comment on knowing yourself is the most critical component of the airmanship model is you. Here's a personal view from Ben Drew, who was a World War II ace, flew Mustangs. Aggressiveness is a natural, and some might say essential, part of most pilots' personalities. but it can set you up for a fall if you let it get the best of you. When you combine aggressiveness and expectations, you can end up fooling yourself and creating a dangerous situation. And I think this is a perfect or some perfect examples of Drew's personal view here are flying VFR into IMC conditions, get their itis. Those are all cases of an aggressive attitude. I'm going to get there. You can fool yourself into thinking you can make it. Oh, that weather isn't going to come down. Or, yeah, I've done a little scud running before. I can get under that low area and I'll be okay on the other side. Or, no problem. It's, yeah, I can climb above this overcast layer here before I get to it and get up on top. And it's my destination's forecast is for broken clouds. I'm a VFR-only pilot. Those are things where aggressiveness and expectations can set you up for a fall. So let me ask you some dumb questions. And of course, you know, the old adage is don't be afraid to ask dumb questions. They're easier to handle than dumb mistakes. And that's really true in aviation. Would you fly an airplane if you found a mechanical problem during pre-flight? I sure hope not. Would you fly into known severe icing in a light single engine? Even with FAA certification, I wouldn't do it. Would you fly into a thunderstorm? I certainly hope you would say no to that. Hang on one second. I see Jim Sweeney has his hand up. Let me open up Jim's mic. Jim, do you have a question?
Yeah, the question on the 500 hours in model, I can see that on complex 121 aircraft. What about in light aircraft that some of the audience may be flying?
Well, the study, let me mute you, I'm sorry, we're getting the study that was used to come up with that figure was an Air Force study, and I pulled that right out of Kern's book, Redefining Airmanship. He doesn't indicate in there what type of aircraft the pilots were flying that they studied, but since it was an Air Force study, I think your assumption here is right. They were complex aircraft versus a very simple general aviation aircraft. So my opinion, this would just be my opinion because, again, I don't know exactly what the data was based on, is that, yeah, if you're flying a Piper Cub around your grass strip, you're probably safe at, 100 hours or maybe 150 hours. That doesn't apply. But, most of our general aviation airplane now, aircraft, have gotten fairly complex. So there's some number there. It may not be the 500 hours, but there's some number there. Does that answer your question, Jim?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, let's move on. Here are some not-so-dumb questions. Would you fly if you were impaired by drugs or alcohol? Well, I hope that you would say no. However, the impaired by drugs part is getting kind of tough to identify. As we get older, the doctors put us on more and more medication. I'm 63 and I'm on a few medications. They're all legal to fly with. I have to jump through some hoops for the FAA, but I get my medical. But what you have to watch out for is combinations, even though you've cleared the drugs that you're on. For example, there are some drugs that if you take with aspirin, they're disqualifying. You can't fly. So aspirin we think of as a benign drug, but it could be in combination with other drugs and impair. So you have to be aware of that. Would you fly if you were ill? Well, we're all going to say no because that's the answer we've been taught to give, but we've all flown ill. How ill? Well, you got a little bit of a head cold. No problem. I'm going to go out and fly today. Well, I've come to the point where I won't fly at all if I'm ill because I think it's too much of an impairer. You're impaired if you're ill to any degree, and as you fatigue on top of that illness, your impairment grows more rapidly than it would if you were just ill. So again, to be on the safe side, you shouldn't fly at all if you're at all ill. Would you fly if you were fatigued? Now this is a tough one too. In private flying, we don't pay much attention to the fatigue factor. Some of us have our personal limitations. We say, no, if I've been up all night or I didn't get a good night's rest, I'm not going to go out there and launch on that dawn patrol and fly all day, fly someplace for a meeting and come back. But a lot of us don't recognize that fatigue, or we think we're tough enough we're going to power through it. But here are the facts. One fact on fatigue. If you have been on duty more than 14 hours, you are more impaired than if you were legally drunk. And that's not someone's opinion, that's empirical data. So, and that's if you've had a good night's sleep the night before. So fatigue is a major factor in a lot of accidents. I wrote a book called False Security, the Real Story About Airline Safety, and in that book I spent quite a bit of time researching fatigue. And of course I was starting to experience that a lot at United just before I left, because we were up to 86 hard hours a month. And we were pretty much always in chronic fatigue, as these guys are now. And then you get in acute fatigue if you couldn't get a good night's rest, or it was a 6 a.m. departure for which you had to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, those kinds of things. And fatigue, when you look at the recent accidents, primarily aircrew accidents, I see fatigue as a major factor in all of them. And fatigue generally isn't looked at much in general aviation accident yet, although now the NTSB is starting to put that into some reports as a contributing cause. So fatigue is a major one, and it's one of the hardest ones for us to deal with. Are you medically airworthy is another concern we have to have and address on each flight. And the chances are you're more concerned about the airplane than you are about yourself. You check out that airplane real good, make sure it's been inspected, make sure it's ready to fly, but you probably are less critical of your personal ability to launch. And we have a tendency to think that we rise above these physiological challenges. We can just put that old hunting knife in our teeth and charge through the thunderstorms. We can get through that fatigue. We can get through that illness, no problem. That's pilots for you. This can-do attitude conflicts with realistic self-knowledge and good airmanship. So here's a solid example of what we're talking about with that knowing yourself, with filling up that pillar of knowledge about self as much as we can. Here's some hazardous psychological attitudes. Get-there-itis, I mentioned a little earlier. We all know about this one, but this has killed many, many pilots, either getting home or getting to the meeting or get-there-itis. Anti-authority. Oh, that FAA, they got all those rigs, and all they're out to do is take my license away, so the heck with them. I'm going to ignore them. Anti-authority. That attitude has killed a lot of pilots. Machismo. I can do it. I'm the best. I'm the greatest. Well, we have to have the high level of self-confidence to be effective pilots, but there's a line over which we can go and where we get dangerous with that kind of attitude. Invulnerability. Now, I don't know about the age spread here of the attendees, but I can remember back when I was flying in my teens, I was totally invulnerable. I did things that I'm lucky to be here to tell you about today. As I get older, of course, that attitude of invulnerability starts to go away, and I don't feel so invulnerable anymore. In fact, I'd probably gone over too far the other way into paranoia about what can happen. So we have to watch out about that feeling of invulnerability. Impulsiveness is another psychological attitude that can get us. Well, I got to get off. I got to take off. I got to take off. If I don't get off now, I'm going to miss my void time. So you rush. You don't do a checklist. You rush your pre-flight, pre-takeoff preparation, and you go and you get yourself in trouble. One example of impulsiveness. Some other hazardous psychological attitudes. Resignation. Get in a situation where you're overloaded and you just say, well, it's going to be what it's going to be. And this attitude has ended up killing pilots when they might have gotten themselves out of the situation if they just kept flying. In fact, we had an old saying in professional flying that the way that the accident investigators determine who was flying the airplane in a two-crew airplane, it's the pilot with the broken wrist and the broken ankles. He was flying that airplane right up to the time that it stopped. So resignation has to be avoided. Complacency. We've all heard about complacency. Oh, I've flown this trip from my home airport over to my where my resort home is 150 times, and I know the route, and it's a nice day, and so I don't have to do all my normal preparation. I'm just going to go. Complacency, that's got many, many pilots. The good old air show syndrome. Watch this, the most dangerous thing you can hear in a cockpit. Let me show you this. We have to avoid that because low altitude maneuvering flight is one of the biggest accident categories on the NTSB General Aviation Accident List. So we have to be really guard against it. And let me back up a second. That air show syndrome, these real air show guys, they're highly skilled. They practice all the time. They've got people coaching them. They've got people certifying them for those air show operations, recurrent training. So, doing air showy kind of things requires a high level of skill and training and preparation. So it's not something to do ad hoc. Watch this. I'm going to make a low pass. A lot of guys have gotten killed by making that low pass and feeling just a little too exuberant when they do the pull-up and do a 2-3G pull-up, roll it over into a steep bank, and you know what happens at that point. So, emotional jet lag. This is another one that's tough to recognize in yourself. Did you just come out of a meeting where you're frustrated and mad, and now you're going to go jump in your airplane and fly home? You're suffering at that point from emotional jet lag. That's impairing you. The only time I ever crashed in an airplane in my 50-some-year career here flying airplanes was when I was going through a divorce. I was in emotional jet lag. In fact, I can recall that when I was flying for United, the pilots that I least liked flying with were the guys that were going through divorces. They were just impaired. They didn't have their head in the game. So you have to be able to recognize that in yourself through knowledge of self. And excessive professional deference is a problem, more so in multi-crew airplanes. Let's say that I'm flying with a co-pilot, and a co-pilot's brand new, and he looks over at me and says, well, that old Pelican over there, he knows what he's doing. I see that mountain coming up, and he's going right for it, but yeah, he must know what he's doing. Well, you can't do that if you're the junior pilot. You've got to speak up. In the case of personal flying, it could be that you get all kinds of vibes out of the weather briefer, but you figure he knows his stuff, and so you're going to defer to his attitude that it's probably not going to get too bad on where you're going. Well, that's a form of professional deference. You've got to make up your own mind. There's some of that involved. It's okay, but excessive professional deference is not. Well, here's what Kern has to say on personal airworthiness. Airworthiness is a personal responsibility. Yes, the flight organization you fly within and the FAA regulations kind of give you a framework, but it depends on how tight that framework is in terms of the organization you're flying within. Maybe you're not flying within any kind of organization. You own your own airplane, it's parked in your own hangar out there. So then it's totally a personal responsibility. It rests on your physical and psychological boundaries, and those boundaries change. Fatigue and so forth. Are you psychologically jet lagged? So those boundaries change, but that's really your airmanship abilities really rest on those boundaries. If we fail to appreciate this fact, we undercut any efforts towards improvement. In other words, if you're not going to recognize when you're fatigued, just going to go out there and fly, you're probably going to negative train yourself with the way you're flying, is one example, and you're not going to improve your airmanship. Although it is critically important to recognize when we are impaired, it's much easier to stay physically and psychologically healthy. So, I'll sound like your mother. Stay healthy, lose the weight, get out there and exercise. But we all know it's been proven over and over, many, many studies, that if we are in good shape, if we're exercising regularly, our tolerance for things like fatigue and other things that can impair us is increased, and it's easier for us to recognize then when we are impaired. It's a big change rather than a little change. This increases personal performance potential and makes it much easier to recognize that impairment. All right, let's look at the pillar of knowledge aircraft, knowledge of aircraft. Samuel Johnson, who was a British author way back, says knowledge is of two kinds. We know a subject ourselves, or we know where we can find information upon it. and this is especially true in piloting, is we have to have certain things in our head, in our memory banks, memory items for our emergency procedures, certain regulations we have to have in our head, our limitations, our proper operating speeds, all those things we have to know in our head. But then there's a whole slew of other things. We just have to know where to go look it up. An example is the Aeronautical Information Manual. There's all kinds of stuff in there that's not regulatory, but it's recommended practice, and it's in there and recommended because somebody either got hurt or almost got hurt by doing something contrary to that recommendation. So, I will admit that for years and years and years, I never went back to that AIM unless I had a specific question I was looking up. And of course then my knowledge went way down, but I knew I could go to that AIM and find it, and that's good. But what's even better is periodic review of the sections of the AIM so that you can put it back into memory banks. Kern, his take on knowledge of aircraft is an aviator's ability to develop a personal relationship with his or her aircraft is one of the key indicators of excellence in airmanship. We all say you got to know your airplane, but it's like a personal relationship with the airplane. You know its traits, you know where it's weak, you know what to expect from it. Knowledge of aircraft is not merely being able to handle or operate a given type of airplane. It is a genuine desire to make the machine an extension of yourself. And I've been thinking about this particular point lately. Really what we do is the airplane goes flying with us. If you're really doing it right, it's just an extension of us, and it comes along with us and it goes where we go. And it's our control inputs and stuff, our subconscious, and the airplane just flies with it. So we really have to think of it that way. The airplane's an extension of ourselves. Like other social arrangements, this relationship must be based on knowledge, understanding, and trust. And that's really true. Would you trust your life to an acquaintance who you just met and barely knew? I would hope not. And yet every day, hundreds of pilots take to the sky an aircraft that they are not completely familiar with. And I think if you're honest with yourself, which you need to be if you're going to be a good airman, you can think of more than one instance when you went out and flew an airplane that you weren't quite familiar enough with. And you need to be totally familiar with the airplane to the extent that you can before you fly. This casual attitude often comes back to haunt unprepared airmen in a multitude of ways, and I can attest to that. I've been in that situation in my younger days. I got into general aviation in the mid-'60s, and man, there was just all kind of flying available. I flew over 1,200 hours in my first year in general aviation because so much flying was available. Flight instructing, charter flying, moving airplanes from here to there, on and on and on. And I jumped in a lot of airplanes that I didn't know enough about. And in some of those cases, I either got into tight situations that I shouldn't have been in, or I felt uncomfortable because I didn't know the airplane well enough. We need to know the airplane. Now, how do you really get to know your airplane? Well, the best way to do it is begin a systematic study of the airplane with a thorough reading of the general description section of the POH. Most of us just skip over that general description, but there's a lot of good info in there, and it gets you oriented for the rest of your study on the airplane. And you continue that study systematically, going through each section of the POH, and you need to do this not only once when you check out on the airplane, but all the time. I mean, once a month, tell yourself at least once a month, I'm going to read a section of the POH, because you know how it fades in memory. You've got to renew that memory consistently. And that's the key to expertise: continuous and systematic study. And all the really good airmen I know are really good at this particular technique. You need to discover the unwritten knowledge and the ergonomic gotchas of the airplane you're flying. Use your knowledge as part of a team. Talk to your maintenance guys, talk to your flight instructor to check you out in the airplane. Join a type-specific club so you can get more information on your airplane you're flying. Sign up for the FAA's AD notification. Get on the FAA's Service Difficulty Report website and and check out the type of airplane you're flying. So you need to build up that knowledge of your airplane in many different ways. What Kern has to say about knowledge of aircraft: no one can ever be sure that they know enough to handle every situation that may come their way in flight. Even the most knowledgeable aviators experience inner doubts about their systems and procedural knowledge, and I can attest to that. Perhaps that is the mark of airmanship relative to aircraft knowledge, the fear that we might not know enough. This fear is good. It in turn fuels the quest for greater understanding. True airmanship is revealed by a systematic and disciplined approach to continuous learning. So let's take a look at the pillar of knowledge team. Ardant Dupic, French officer and military theorist, said way back when, 4 brave men who do not know each other will not dare to attack a lion. 4 less brave men, but knowing each other well, sure of their reliability, and consequently mutual aid, will attack resolutely. Kern says, good teams are made up of good individuals. Ironically, teamwork is an individual responsibility, like much of the rest of airmanship. Here's a personal view about teamwork by Steve Ritchie, who was a F4 Vietnam ace. I feel very fortunate to have received so much of the credit that really belongs to so many others. There were literally thousands of military and civilians involved in my success. Learning to operate within a team may well be the single most important thing we can do to contribute to success, and that's airmanship success he's talking about. Successful outcome for every flight. The value of teamwork. Teamwork seeks to improve performance in 3 primary ways. It adds to the pool of knowledge and expertise available to confront various situations. It allows for a synthesis of ideas and skills to make new options available to the group. Expert teams are capable of synergy. Teamwork is an aviator's insurance policy. So you're probably sitting there thinking, well, what kind of team do I operate on? You know, I have my airplane parked in the hangar, and I just go out and fly it. Well, you do have a team. Your maintenance guys are your team. The guys that fuel your airplane are your team. The flight service station guys are your team when you call for a briefing. The air traffic control guys are on your team. So even if you're flying your own airplane out of your own hangar, you still have a team. And of course, if you're flying within an organization that has things like safety culture, safety management system, recurrent training, mentor pilots, all those kinds of things, dispatchers, your team grows, and you have more people to help you to have a safe flight. Here's Kern's take on teamwork. Teamwork does not remove final authority or responsibility for safe operations from the pilot command. Good teamwork begins with effective leadership. Sometimes you're the leader, sometimes you're the follower, but most times as a pilot you're the leader. You lead your team, so you've got to be effective at it. You've got to learn leadership skills. Good teams establish norms of safety, compliance, communication, and cooperation. And when we get later on in the webinar series talking about safety cultures and safety management systems, you're going to see this talked about a lot in detail. Good teams, what they are, how they work, and how do you make them work better all the time. A good team establishes an environment conducive to good team operations. For example, let's say that you have a regular fueler at your airport, fuels your airplane, and you tell him to give me 20 gallons on each side. And he comes back to you a little bit later and says, oh, I messed up. I put 30 gallons on one side and 10 on the other. Do you want me to do anything? And you say to him, nah, it'll still fly, no problem. You know, I got plenty of aileron authority with that fuel load. I know I can do it, so just forget it. You know, hey, by the way, you don't need to bother me with that kind of information anymore. Well, that's kind of extreme, but that's an example of bad leadership, and that establishes a bad environment. Because the next time that fueler isn't going to tell you. He's just going to do it because he figures, you don't care, or you got it under control. So you've got to foster that good communications in that case. This environment fosters assertiveness, honesty, and trust. And if we don't have that from every team member on the team, we have a defective team. And assertiveness means they've got to speak up if they think there's a problem and tell you about it. Honesty, of course, they've got to tell it to you straight. No twist, no spin. And all of that, then over time, builds trust. We've got to be able to trust what we think they're going to do, they're going to do it. Of course, I'm of the Reagan of opinion, trust but verify. All right, let's talk about the environment pillar of knowledge. Knowledge of environment. Luther Burbank, who was an American botanist, had this take on it. If you violate nature's laws, you are your own prosecuting attorney, judge, jury, and hangman. And of course, the big law that we violate all the time is the law of gravity, so we have to be careful. Kern says our operational environment can affect safety, effectiveness, and efficiency. In short, our airmanship. So that's the operational environment. Personal view by Dr. Elkov, who was a Navy aviator, Vietnam era. He says, good airmanship should encompass the art of listening. A pilot must continually gather information to create and maintain a mental model of the flight environment. And of course, we know this is situational awareness. This data must be perceived and organized into meaningful information on which to base decisions. And of course, we call this judgment. Physical environment is the medium in which we operate. It influences almost everything we do in an airplane. It includes some factors that remain relatively constant and others that change. Like the runway we fly off of normally, that's relatively constant, although it can get icy and it can have a crosswind on a particular day. But others change all the time, and of course the best example of that is the weather. The regulatory environment that we have to operate within. Many regs should be written in red ink, in my opinion, because their origins can be traced to the blood of fallen aviators. However, many pilots feel that flying has become overregulated. I hear that all the time. Others disagree, citing the need for more stringent regulations. I happen to be one of those in certain areas. I'll give you one example. The current regulation for instrument currency is 6 approaches, intercept a course and track, and a holding pattern every 6 months to maintain your currency. If you do that, you can legally go out and jump in an airplane and fly in the clouds. Well, I do a lot of recurrent training and initial training with experienced instrument pilots in simulators. And I see all the time where these guys are current, but they shouldn't be out flying in low weather. Now, when I ask them about their personal minimums, they all give me the right answer. Oh, no, I know I'm not proficient, so my personal minimums, if there's an ILS at the other end, I want at least 500 feet in a mile rather than the minimums, which are normally 200 feet and a half mile. So that's good. I hope they adhere to that. But I think there ought to be, the regulation for currency should be much more stringent than it is. For example, the regs don't require a missed approach. Missed approaches in IFR conditions are very dangerous. We hardly ever do them. If we don't practice them, and if we're not disciplined and do them right, they can result in an accident, and they do frequently result in fatal accidents. So I believe that at least that 6-month requirement should include a missed approach. Another thing that's not in that regulation is that it says 6 approaches, but it says nothing about whether you're VFR, IFR, and what minimums or anything else. So again, there are some areas of the regulations that I believe should be more stringent. It's not all over-regulation. In some areas I would agree with you, but if you say that we're over-regulated. No matter what, though, what we think about that, what our opinion is, we are bound by the regulatory environment in which we fly. That's it. Those are the regs. Other pilots base their actions on the expectations of our compliance. That's a big factor. I turn this around a little bit and say, I expect you, when I'm out there flying in the same airspace, that you're going to conform to the regs. When you don't, you make it more dangerous for both you and me. Your organizational environment, that's part of the environment. Organizational environment, or it's commonly called corporate culture, is a relatively recent idea. It applies to some of the concepts and methods from cultural anthropology and business, and it applies to modern organizations. And I recall I was involved when we put the cockpit resource management program together for the first time for United Airlines back in the early 80s. And we actually hired a business consulting firm that taught what really is the equivalent of cockpit resource management in the business world, to adapt those techniques and procedures and processes to cockpit resource management. So that's really airmanship development. The things we talk about, a lot of it really came from the business world. The organizational environment should employ the principles of shared decision-making, advocacy, and assertiveness. We've seen the advocacy and assertiveness before, but shared decision-making, you get a much better result if there's more than just you making those decisions. The organizational environment should include a safety culture and a safety management system. And again, we're going to talk about this in detail later on. Here's what Kern has to say on the pillar of knowledge environment. Knowledge of the environment is by far the most difficult of the pillars of knowledge to master. Begin with a solid understanding of the physical environment. That means know your weather and so forth. Make flight planning a methodical exercise that completely covers all of the environmental factors you might encounter in a flight. And that means I've gotten to the point, even after all my years of flying, I have a checklist for my pre-flight planning so I don't miss anything. I go through it methodically. The multi-layered regulatory environment is of critical importance to the physical longevity of all aviators. So even though we might not like those regs, remember, they were written in blood. Find out about your organization. Seek the true values and work to improve them if necessary. You've got to be involved, no matter what kind of organization you're flying within. Finally, be at home in these environments. Swim like a fish. Know how to operate within the environment you're in. All right, let's take a look at the last of the 5 pillars of knowledge, risk. Count von Moltke, who was a Prussian Army Chief of Staff, said, first reckon, then risk. My mother used to always say, look before you leap. Same idea. Kern says, you must understand the other elements of airmanship to understand, assess, and manage risk. And you must manage risk to grow in airmanship. So I hope you're starting to see how interrelated all of these are. The 3 bedrock principles and the 5 pillars of knowledge, how they actually, there's a lot of interplay between them to get the result, the capstone outcomes you're looking for of situational awareness and good judgment. Here's a personal view of by Stephen Kuntz. He was an naval aviator, and I'm sure you've read at least one of his books. Great, he writes really good books on aviation. Risk makes life worth living. Life itself is a gamble. Random chance rules our lives. There is no substitute for sound, thorough preparation to avoid or cope with foreseeable misfortune. So we have to be prepared. Knowledge of risk, there are reasons we take these risks. Where there is no risk, there's usually no opportunity. So we're getting up there and flying because the opportunity that we're going after, either it's a business opportunity, it's an opportunity for recreation, an opportunity to see family, whatever it might be. There's that opportunity, and the risk is the other, is all of those risks we run to capture that opportunity. We constantly make decisions that affect our effectiveness, efficiency, and our safety. And that's in our everyday life and in our flying life. We're always making these decisions. So if we're doing it, we need to learn techniques, processes, procedures to get better at it. And when you learn them for your flying, they transfer directly to your personal life, your business life. I've run several businesses over the years, and I'm always amazed at how you can apply decision-making, aeronautical decision-making, cockpit resource management, all this airmanship stuff we're talking about to a business. It's really, you can use the same techniques and the same processes. Risk-taking, let's talk about that. Risk is the probability and severity of loss linked to a hazard. So, that we see that the weather is going to be 502 at our destination. what's the probability and severity of loss? Well, severity, if we crash at the other end, is very severe. Probability of that, not very great if I'm proficient and I've got an ILS approach. I'm only going down to 500, or the ceiling's 500, visibility's 2 miles, no problem. So we have to balance those when we make our risk assessments. We manage risk by controlling it, avoiding it, reducing it, spreading it, and transferring it. So those are the ways we manage risk. And again, each one of these bullet points here is something that we can learn techniques for, processes for, procedures for, to mitigate those risks that we face. Now there are some risks to our airmanship development. Discipline is the big one. We talked about that before. If you can't maintain that almost perfect discipline, or at least very good discipline, your airmanship isn't going to improve and you're going to be less safe. You're going to have less fun flying. Risks to skill, we talked about those, the skills deteriorate rapidly. Risk to proficiency. If you don't fly frequently and fly with a purpose and focus on developing your airmanship each time you fly, then your proficiency is going to suffer. Risk to knowledge. Well, one of the risks to knowledge is getting older. Our memory banks don't quite work as well, so we have to refresh our memories more frequently or use techniques to support our failing memories. Risk to situational awareness. And again, there are a number of risks to situational awareness, but the first big one is not practicing the Bedrock principles and the pillars of knowledge. So there are risks to that. Risk to judgment. We're going to talk a lot about that next time. So risk management. Do not accept unnecessary risks. You have to think it through. Do I really need to get there? Here's an example. Make risk decisions at the appropriate level. Most of the time this falls on our shoulders because we don't have a support team. But maybe if you're operating in an organization that has a hierarchy of pilot management in it, maybe you need to bump the decision up to the next level. See what that chief pilot thinks about it. Consider accepting risk only when the benefits outweigh the cost. In other words, always keep that equation in proper balance. And of course, you never want to get into the situation that picture depicts there is rolling the dice. If you're rolling the dice, if you're thinking, well, I think it's going to be okay, or I'll trust my luck, I'm usually lucky, you now have stepped over the line and you're in a high-risk area. Here's what Kern has to say about risk. Aviation will never be completely risk-free. The ability of airmen to understand and analyze multiple risk factors and then act on them using skill and good judgment will always be one of the principal benchmarks of expertise in aviation. And that's what all this airmanship development is about, giving you a model, a framework, a track, a flight plan to always get better. So in the first session, we talked about the Bedrock principles. In this section, we covered the pillars of knowledge. And in the next session, session 3, we'll take a very close look at situational awareness and judgment. Here's a final perspective. Just want to review I'll go over the airmanship model one more time. And again, I think in the first session, you probably recall I said we had a rule of thumb at United Airlines Training Center that you had to hear a fact, a point, a data point, whatever, at least 5 times before you started to integrate that into your personal operation. And so I will do some repetition here, but that is a bedrock principle, if you will, of training. So I'm going to say this like I said it before in terms of the model. If we practice the bedrock principles of discipline, skill, and proficiency while striving for more perfect knowledge of self, aircraft, team, environment, and risk, we can expect ever-improving capstone outcomes of situational awareness and better judgment. At this point in the seminar series, are you ready to answer the question, and this is still rhetorical, if I don't fly right, should I fly at all? So you need to be thinking about that one, and we're going to get down to that in detail. I'm going to ask for an answer to that question when we get here to the end of the series. So the next steps are yours, and here are my recommendations for your next steps. Complete the Redefining Airmanship webinar series. Read Kern's Redefining Airmanship. Remember, this series is like the Cliff Notes. Even though it's 6 hours long, it still is just cutting across the surface of what Kern has to say about redefining airmanship. So I highly recommend you read the book in addition to completing the series. Get in the airmanship loop. Go over to airmanshipexcellence.org. Sign up for airmanship updates so that you're in the loop on new information and things that you can do to improve your airmanship. The Center for Airmanship Excellence has held 2 airmanship excellence events so far, and there will be more. So there are a lot of things you can get involved with to help you improve your airmanship. And the biggest one, though, the biggest step you can take is commit to a continuous airmanship development plan. And we'll talk about how to develop one of those later on in the series. So now I've got just a couple of questions here for you. Let me get those guys going. Here's some poll questions. Are you going to get in the airmanship loop by registering at the Center for Airmanship Excellence? And it's either yes or no at this point. If you don't know yet, just don't answer the question. Okay, not all of you have voted yet, so I guess you're probably in the category of don't know yet. Okay, and here's what you came up with, though. 100% of those of you who did answer said yes, but that was only about half of you. Second question. Are you ready to commit to a continuous airmanship development? Yes, no, or not sure yet. So now I've got to answer for all of you. So I see you're voting. Okay, great. And all of you that voted, which was almost all of you, said yes. So that's good. I'm encouraged to hear that. Do you believe that you should practice the 3 Bedrock principles to become a better airman? Yes, no, or not sure yet. Almost all of you voted. Okay. And as you can see, everybody said yes. Again, I'm very encouraged to see that. Just have a couple more here for you. Do you plan on reading Kern's Redefining Airmanship, the book? Okay. Here are the results. 60% said yes, and the rest of you said not sure yet. That's fine. Do you plan to complete the Redefining Airmanship webinar series? Yes, no, not sure yet. Okay, I'll close the poll. And all of you say yes. Great. Glad to hear that. And the final question. Do you think that you should strive for the maximum possible level of knowledge in each of the 5 pillars of knowledge? Yes, no, not sure yet. Okay, great. You all said yes. All right. Well, thank you for answering those questions for me. And do you have any questions or comments? Okay, Jim Sweeney, I'm going to open up your mic. I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
The web address for the airmanship site?
That's going to come up in a minute, Jim. I'll show it to you so you can write it down.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I'd like to thank you all for attending, and here's the contact information. You can reach me at that phone number. If you have an email you want to have a question you want to email to me or a comment, there's my email address. And the website for the Center for Airmanship Excellence is airmanshipexcellence.org. Well, thank you all for attending today. I enjoyed working with you on this, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in Session 3.